My father's voice cut through the line like a blade. "You're no longer my daughter!" No warning, no hesitation, just a sentence that shattered something I thought could never break. In that moment, I realized love in my family was conditional, and I was the one erased. My name is Sophronia Kent, and this is how I found out I was written out of his life and his will. The pencil slipped from my hand when the phone rang. I was hunched over blueprints in my Portland apartment, the hum of the printer filling the room with a steady rhythm, when his voice came through, cold, clipped, almost mechanical. One sentence, then silence. The line went dead before I could even breathe. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the wall, the weight of those words pressing into my chest until I couldn't hear the printer anymore. The air in the apartment seemed to collapse, as if the walls themselves had shrunk in closer. I'd spent years carving out a life with nothing but grit and late nights, and in the space of a phone call, he stripped me of something no amount of work could replace. I walked to the window. Outside, rain streaked the glass in thin, uneven lines. Portland's gray sky sagging low over the city. Cars hissed along wet pavement. People rushed under umbrellas, unaware that in one corner apartment, someone had just been erased. Memories of the coast pushed their way in, uninvited, the crunch of sand beneath small shoes, the heavy hand on my shoulder guiding me down the shoreline, the sound of gulls circling overhead. I used to believe those moments would anchor me forever. Now, they were splintered, fragile shards I didn't dare touch. One call, one sentence. It wasn't just rejection, it carried the chill of something calculated, as if behind the cruelty lay papers already signed, a plan already executed, and whether I wanted to or not, I would have to follow that thread, straight into the truth he wanted buried. Holloway's office smelled of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to history and secrets. The ceiling fan turned lazily above, stirring the air without breaking the tension that had already settled thick around us. He slid a leather folder across the desk, his voice formal, almost detached, as he read aloud. My father had signed everything over, the coastal inns, the land, the accounts, all of it to Marla and her children. My portion, a single dollar, and a clause that warned if I contested, I would lose even that insult. I didn't move, but my fingers dug into the armrest until my knuckles ached. Holloway avoided my eyes, fumbling with his pen until it clattered onto the desk. For a moment, the room echoed with that tiny metallic sound. When he finally looked at me, there was something more than pity in his gaze, something uneasy, as if he carried a burden heavier than the will itself. The tremor in his hands, the way his glasses slipped lower on his nose, all betrayed what his words didn't. This wasn't just business. Something else was hidden in those files, and it terrified him more than telling me I'd been erased. Silence stretched until I thought he might dismiss me, but Holloway cleared his throat, voice faltering. He admitted there had once been something else, a document my mother left with him long ago, with explicit instructions it should reach me when I was grown. But the week after her funeral, it vanished from his files. The admission hollowed me out. That meant someone, somewhere, had made sure her voice was buried with her. With shaking fingers, he reached into his drawer and pulled out a small brass key, taped to a card embossed with the name of a local bank. The metal caught the dim light as he slid it across the desk. "First Coastal Bank," he said quietly. "Your mother wanted you to have this." I closed my hand around the key, its weight hotter than metal should feel, a spark of both fear and defiance burning in my chest. Outside, faint and distant, a ship's horn sounded from the harbor, cutting through Portland's gray drizzle. It felt like a call from the coast of my childhood, summoning me back toward the waves, and toward a truth my father never wanted me to find. I drove down the coastal highway, with the brass key heavy in my pocket, the Pacific wind forcing its way through the crack in the window. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, the same scent that used to cling to my hair after long days at the inn with my mother. Her voice returned to me with each gust, steady and certain, reminding me not to let anyone rewrite my story. When I reached town, I felt a jolt of recognition mixed with grief. The inn where I had once stacked linens and scrubbed counters now bore a new sign. Marla's name stenciled boldly across the wood. Seeing it was like being punched in the chest. I stood on the sidewalk staring until the sound of gulls overhead broke the spell. Later, I ran into Mrs. Kravitz outside the corner store. She swore she remembered signing papers for my mother years ago, saying Margaret had been meticulous about protecting me. Her words tightened the knot already forming inside me. That knot pulled tighter still when I sought out Earl, the old manager. He didn't hesitate, saying bluntly that without my mother's money, the inn never would have survived its first summer. Standing there with the surf roaring in the distance, I understood that my father hadn't simply cut me out. He had begun erasing my mother altogether. The county archives smelled of dust and ink, the silence broken only by the scrape of folders pulled from metal drawers. I spread the documents across a scarred wooden table, tracing signatures that looked shaky, foreign, and wrong. The deeper I read, the more the pattern revealed itself. Deeds had been altered when my father was lying in a hospital bed. A notary stamp appeared from a distant county with no plausible reason to be there. Every line on the page whispered of fraud dressed up in legal language. I stepped outside with the rain pressing down on my shoulders and walked across to the bank, needing to see the truth with my own eyes. The clerk behind the counter hesitated before leaning forward to confide that Marla had been withdrawing money from an account in my mother's name for years. Each withdrawal matched the very moments when the inns expanded and new property was acquired. By the time I walked back into the gray drizzle, I felt the betrayal in my bones. The lies weren't limited to my father's shaky hand. Marla had been orchestrating from the shadows all along, reaching into what my mother left and twisting it to her own gain. The picture was no longer of negligence or oversight, but of deliberate theft carried out under the guise of family. The Sunday evening air carried the smell of roast beef as I stepped into my father's coastal house. The chandelier spilled golden light over the dining table, where he, Marla, and her 3 children laughed as though the world were perfectly intact. I didn't take a seat. Instead, I set my phone down in the center of the table, the red light glowing. My voice was steady when I said, "I know about the will. I know the cabin and the inns were never yours to give away." Silence crashed down. My father's face flushed crimson, and he slammed his hand against the table, rattling knives and glasses. "You walked away," he shouted. "Don't come back demanding anything now." Marla reached out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's not create drama in front of family," she urged. I locked my gaze on her. Family? Or a staged robbery dressed up in signatures? The words hung heavy until one of her sons blurted out what he wasn't supposed to say. Mom said to sign it quickly so the cabin transfer wouldn't fall through. His siblings froze, the slip echoing louder than any outburst. I leaned forward. "And what about the key to the bank box?" My father's jaw tightened, eyes darting before he looked away. In that moment, the dining room wasn't a place for supper. It had become a courtroom, and without realizing it, they'd handed me the first piece of their own undoing. The next morning, I walked into First Coastal Bank, the brass key warm in my pocket. The vault was cold, lined with metal drawers that whispered of secrets. A clerk set a narrow box on the table and left me alone. I slid the key into the lock, heart hammering, and opened it. Inside lay an envelope, its paper yellowed with age, my mother's handwriting curling across the front. "For Sophronia. When she's ready." My hands shook as I tore it open. Her words rose from the page, alive and fierce, telling me the wealth came from her side of the family, that it was mine to inherit, and that if anyone tried to claim otherwise, I must stand up and fight. The sound of her voice filled the silent room until tears blurred the ink. Beneath the letter was more than proof of her intent. A thick passbook bore my name alone, its balance stretching into 6 figures. My breath caught. She had planned for me, shielded me, even after death. The letter carried a date and a witness signature that matched Mrs. Kravitz's memory. The truth burned through me. My father hadn't just cut me out. He had stolen the very future my mother had set aside. Now I held the evidence he could never erase, the weapon that would carry me into the fight for justice. The courthouse was packed long before I arrived. Word had spread through the small coastal town, and every seat was filled, neighbors craning to see, reporters scribbling in notepads. The air was thick with the damp smell of salt carried in from the ocean, mixing with the varnish of the wooden benches. I stepped inside wearing a dark suit, the weight of the folder in my hands pressing against my ribs like armor. Across the aisle, my father sat stiff as stone, his face unreadable. Marla leaned toward him, whispering furiously, her bracelets jingling as she gestured, but he kept his eyes fixed forward. When the bailiff called order, Holloway rose beside me. He looked older than I remembered, but his voice carried firm authority as he unfolded the envelope I had pulled from the vault. He read aloud my mother's words, her handwriting preserved in every line. "This inheritance belongs to Sophronia. It is her right, and no one else's." The courtroom stilled. Even the shuffle of papers stopped, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear her. My father slammed a hand on the table and rose to his feet. "This is sentiment," he barked, his voice echoing. "It has no standing under the law." His lawyer pulled at his sleeve, urging him to sit, but he refused until the judge, stern and deliberate, ordered him down. The judge lifted the document again, adjusting his glasses, and his brow furrowed. "This notary seal," he said slowly, "is from outside the county." His gaze shifted to the defense. "Explain why a local estate would require such an irregularity." My father's attorney stumbled, muttering something about convenience, but the doubt in the judge's eyes was clear. Then a banker stepped forward, a young man I had spoken with only days before. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. He confirmed years of withdrawals from my mother's original account, funds siphoned at the same time the ins expanded, always under Marla's hand. Gasps rippled through the room. Marla's painted smile faltered, and I saw her clutch the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles went white. Before the murmurs died, another figure rose from the back. Earl, the former manager, shuffled forward with a folder clasped in his calloused hands. He cleared his throat, placed it on the clerk's desk, and announced that he had kept copies of the original investment documents. Inside lay receipts, contracts, and signatures. My mother's name etched in steady strokes across every page. "Without her money," he said firmly, "there never would have been an inn to argue about." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father sat rigid, his jaw clenched, but the mask of control cracked. His hands gripped the edge of the table until they shook, and for the first time in years, I saw him falter. The courtroom seemed to lean toward him, the weight of truth pressing from all sides. I didn't feel triumph then, only the crushing reality of how far he had gone to erase me, to erase her. But as the judge collected the documents and studied them in silence, I knew the tide had turned. My father's empire wasn't built on his strength, it was built on my mother's sacrifice. And now, at last, everyone could see it. The sound of the gavel striking wood cut through the tension like thunder. The judge's voice carried across the hushed courtroom, deliberate and unwavering. The amended will was invalid. Every transfer that erased me was struck down. The cabin by the lake, the share of the inns ceded by my mother's money, and the savings account in my name were to be restored to me as rightful heir. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a ripple of shock spread through the room. Marla's face drained of color, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Her children sat stiff and silent, exchanging nervous glances, but keeping their eyes lowered, as if by looking at me, they might be implicated in their mother's schemes. Across the aisle, my father stared into the wood grain of the table. His hands clamped to its edge until his knuckles blanched, but his eyes stayed fixed downward, hollow and empty. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharper this time. To strike a daughter from her rightful legacy while benefiting from her mother's resources is not only unlawful, it is unconscionable. His words echoed against the paneled walls, and I felt them settle like a verdict on more than just paper. My father flinched. Though he didn't look up, a low murmur swept through the benches as neighbors and townsfolk absorbed the ruling. These were the same people who had once whispered that I was the abandoned daughter, the one cast out, the soldier who'd walked away from home. Their eyes now met mine differently, no longer pitying, no longer dismissive. There was recognition there, and even a hint of respect. Beside me, Holloway closed the folder slowly. Relief etched across his face. My breath left in a long exhale. Not triumphant, but steady. I hadn't come here to humiliate anyone. I had come to drag the truth into the light, to give my mother's voice weight again. For years, she had been reduced to a footnote in the family's story, her sacrifices buried under signatures and stamped seals. Today, her words lived again, spoken aloud before a judge and a town that could no longer pretend not to hear. My father finally muttered, barely audible, "I only wanted to hold everything together." His words broke in the middle, caught between excuse and confession. I didn't answer. The time for explanations had passed. He had clung to control so tightly that he'd strangled what little remained of our family bond. Whatever he thought he was preserving had already shattered. When the session adjourned, the courthouse steps buzzed with voices. Reporters leaned in, neighbors whispered. By the time I stepped outside, the story had already shifted. No longer was I simply the daughter disowned. I had become the daughter who reclaimed what her mother left, who refused to be erased. And for the first time in years, I walked through that small town square not as an outsider, but as someone who had brought the truth home. Months later, I stood on the porch of the inn that had once been the center of my childhood. The old sign was gone, replaced with a polished wooden board that read The Margaret Inn. Its letters gleamed in the coastal sun, a quiet testament to the woman who had built the foundation for everything. Travelers wheeled their bags across the lot, some pausing to admire the view of the ocean just beyond the dunes. From the reception desk inside, a framed photograph of my mother smiled back at me, her eyes bright as though she were welcoming guests herself. The work had been relentless, repairs, fresh paint, new linens, and yet, with every nail hammered and every wall scrubbed, I felt as though I was restoring more than a building. I was stitching together a memory, making a place where her name and her sacrifice could never again be erased. Alongside the reopening, I established the Margaret Fund, a scholarship for young students of architecture who dreamed of designing with the same care and vision my mother lived by. That afternoon, while the tide rolled in and the air smelled of brine, I saw a figure on the path leading up to the inn. My father approached slowly, his back bent, his cap crumpled in one hand. Without a word, he lowered himself into the chair beside me. The years had carved lines into his face, but his silence carried more weight than any speech he might have prepared. I poured a second cup of coffee and slid it across the table. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. The waves pounded a steady rhythm against the shore, filling the silence between us. We didn't speak of forgiveness, nor of the trial, nor of the damage already done. The space between us was no longer filled with accusation, but it wasn't healed either. We simply sat there, side by side, listening to the surf, two people bound by blood, yet separated by choices that could never be undone. And in that quiet, I realized the victory wasn't in reconciliation. It was here, in the name above the door, in the fund that would carry her legacy forward, in the undeniable truth that my mother's story had been restored. Some wounds never close, but the truth had been pulled back into the light. That was enough. That was the real inheritance,